Okay, now that we have an overview of some common characteristics of early Greek philosophy, I'd like to cover with you in a little more in-depth some fragments that we actually have by these physikoi. Now, the first extant fragment we have in Western philosophy that's survived to us and come down to us is attributed to Anaximander of Miletus. And he was at his prime around 560 BC. So he wrote an entire work on nature, but we only have five fragments. And the five fragments, when we piece together these five fragments, these first known utterances of Western philosophy, we're afforded a glimpse into the birth of Western philosophy. So let me read you these five passages. We have this: the non-limited, the aperon, A-P-E-R-I-O-N, is the original material of existing things. Further, the source from which existing things derive their existence is also that to which they return at their destruction, according to necessity. For they give justice and make reparation to one another for their injustice, according to the arrangement of time. So that's the biggest, longest fragment. But we have four others. There's one fragment that simply begins at the middle of some sentence, and all we have is this, and then there's a hole in the lacuna, there's a hole in the papyrus scroll, so there's no way of reading anything. This, and then there's a blank, is everlasting and ageless. Third fragment is a lacuna in the papyrus scroll, and then is immortal and indestructible. The fourth one is nozzle of bellows. And the fifth one is a stone column. So that's all we have. And these are the first known fragments of Western philosophy. Well, it's clear from the first fragment that this one is the most important and the most telling. 2 and 4 shed light on number 1. And fragment 5 is referring to something else, probably the earth. But that's my speculation. Nietzsche, his early discussion of Anaximander in the book I want you to read, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, is contained in section 4 of that book. I think it deserves our attention, but we have to interpret what Nietzsche says with a critical eye, especially in the light of Heidegger's lengthy and profound reading of the Anaximander fragment. Heidegger wrote this like 50, 60-page essay called the Anaximander fragment. And he has a completely different interpretation from that of Nietzsche. Nietzsche begins by reconstructing Anaximander's thinking process. According to Anaximander, Nietzsche correctly pieces these together. The origin of all coming to be and the passing away of all coming to be are one and the same thing. That which is everlasting and ageless, that's one of the fragments, and it's also immortal and indestructible, is the source from which all becoming is pouring forth, like from a nozzle of bellows. I think that's the meaning of that fragment, nozzle of a bellows. All that is one. It's the same place into which all things return and after they abide for a while. It's like the Alpha and the Omega in the Bible. So this Alpha and Omega of all things is the aperon, the unlimited, or some translators translate it as the indeterminate. The word means literally without limit, aperon. Since all material things, and this is Nietzsche's reconstructing of Anaximander's thinking, and I think it's quite correct. Anaximander is thinking this way. Since all material things are limited, and since all limited things come to an end, if the origin of all the material world, of nature, was any of the four elements, in other words, if the origin were material, then it would have already come to an end. Why? It has an infinite amount of time to have done that already. Okay? But behold, there's still something. The world is with us. Therefore, since all things are still with us, it means that the origin of all things must necessarily be something without limits. It must be limitless. Hence the designation apeiron. So this is not so primitive thinking from the first known physicist. This means this much of Nietzsche's reading of Anaximander is solid and indisputable, I think. But Nietzsche goes on to interpret the implications of this fragment. The latter part of the fragment, the part that tells us why things come into existence and why they pass away. Nietzsche claims that according to Anaximander, things come into being and pass away because they're being punished for breaking from the one, from the apeiron. There's a fall, as it were, from the one, a breaking away from the primal unity, a fission from the one to the many. And this is why they're passing away. Their passing away is punishment, Nietzsche interprets. They are, as Anaximander says, paying reparation for coming to be. In other words, all things are guilty for nothing more than their coming into being as finite things. Their punishment for being is that they are sentenced to death, and that's why everything is passing away. So that's Nietzsche's reading of the Anaximander fragment, in essence. Nietzsche's reading of this first known fragment of Western philosophy appears quite sound at first, because why else could Anaximander have meant, what else could he have meant when he said, for they give justice and make reparation to one another for their injustice according to the arrangement of time? But when we listen to Heidegger's careful treatment of the Anaximander fragment, we're offered an entirely different interpretation. I'm not going to attempt here a full account of Heidegger's essay on Anaximander. It's well beyond our purposes here. But I do want to point out in passing that while Heidegger is well aware of Nietzsche's reading of Anaximander, he dismisses Nietzsche's reading in the first few pages of his essay, confident that his own interpretation will make it obvious how far Nietzsche's reading is from Anaximander's own intentions. According to Heidegger, there's nothing in the fragment that suggests that things are fallen or that they are guilty and paying for their injustice against the one. For Heidegger, Anaximander is not offering a moral interpretation of existence. The injustice that Anaximander speaks of, characterizing the coming into being of things, is not meant to be a moral admonition. It simply means that things come to be because they're engaged in a tension with their opposite. Heat is warring with cold, wet is warring with hot, with dry, and so on. The passing of things is not punishment for their coming into being. Things pass because to be means to be subject of the demands of time, and time is passing because opposites are transforming into one another. Well, whether or not Heidegger is correct in lifting Anaximander out of Nietzsche's moral interpretation is hard to tell, given the paucity of evidence we have with these five fragments. The fact that Anaximander says, in mentioning the injustice that things have committed and their reparation they're paying, their destruction, the fact that he says to one another leads me to think that he's closer to Heraclitus in thinking that coming to be is the product of the struggle of opposites, whereby one opposite gains ascendancy and then the other passes. It may well be that Nietzsche is here searching for reasons or projecting reasons why later philosophy and Christian theology has so strongly condemned earthly existence, and why later philosophy and traditional theology has found it necessary to fabricate another or better metaphysical world beyond this veil of tears we call life. Perhaps Nietzsche is trying to see in an embryonic form this condemnation of life. Perhaps he wanted to see this idea already in embryonic form in Anaximander. But it's hard to pin this embryonic idea of original sin, this condemnation of earthly existence, to Anaximander, given the fragments we have. So Nietzsche ends his discussion of Anaximander with the question, how does Anaximander answer the question of the origin of coming to be and passing away? Passing by the possibility that we cannot really know the answer because we simply don't have enough information from Anaximander, Nietzsche assumes that Anaximander's answer to that question is through a mystical possibility, that eternal coming to be can have its source only in eternal being. Here Nietzsche makes a transition to his most influential predecessor, namely Heraclitus of Ephesus. Because it's in response to this question that Heraclitus appears for Nietzsche. Although Nietzsche mentions other eminent pre-Platonic philosophers, as he calls them at that time, in philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, like Pythagoras and the Pythagorean school, which is so important. You've heard of Pythagoras from the famous Pythagorean theorem, of Democritus, of Anaximenes, Empedocles. He mentions them in passing, and he expounds on their ideas in his lectures that I told you that were published. But he considers in depth only 3 other philosophers in this little book, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, namely Heraclitus, and then Parmenides, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaxagoras. So let's consider Nietzsche's view of Parmenides and Heraclitus, because I find in this profound polemics between these two pre-Socratic thinkers a crossroads, as it were, at the very beginnings of Western intellectual history, of Western culture. Nietzsche's later philosophy can in fact be understood as a great commentary on how and why Western philosophy has taken the Parmenidean road and not the Heraclitean road that he followed. As we proceed with our survey of classical and later Hellenistic Greek philosophy, and as we examine selections from the medieval philosophers, we'll have occasion to see the extent to which later Greek philosophy and traditional medieval theology has taken the road most traveled by, namely the Parmenidean road, and not the way first opened by Heraclitus. The road that Western intellectual history bypassed was the way opened by Heraclitus. And although Plato and later philosophy interpreted elements of both Parmenidean and Heraclitean ideas, their final admixture in Plato involving siding with Parmenides as the basis of his philosophy. And we'll examine this more fully when we proceed beyond pre-Socratic thought. At this point, we need to gain an understanding of the road Western civilization did not take, although there are a few who did, namely Nietzsche and a handful of others. For example, Bergson in modern times, or the process philosophers in American philosophy. But for the most part, Western philosophy and theology followed Parmenides in their assumptions, basic assumptions about reality. If you're interested in Heraclitus and pursuing your study of Heraclitus, the best collection of the original fragments, not only of Heraclitus, but of all the pre-Socratic philosophers, is contained in a book by Kathleen Freeman. It's called Ancilla to the Pre-Socratic Philosophers. It came out in 1948, and it's still the most authoritative and best translation of all the fragments that we have by pre-Socratic philosophers. But it was concerning Heraclitus in particular. There's a book called The Art and Thought of Heraclitus, came out in 2008 by Charles Kahn. It contains all the fragments, and they're topically arranged, and he has a really wonderful commentary. But those are the two books I would recommend if you wanted to pursue your study of the pre-Socratics in general and of Heraclitus in particular. But among the great philosophers, as I said earlier, Heidegger and Nietzsche are among the few who've written extensively on Heraclitus, and their accounts are well worth reading for anybody who wishes to enter into an in-depth understanding of his thought. I'd like to read to you the paper that I read in Samos, Greece, during my first trip to Greece. I stayed there in Greece for 3 weeks, and on the third week, we went to Samos, which is a beautiful island. It's the furthest east island. You can see Turkey from there, and they had a conference there on Ionian philosophy, of which Heraclitus is part of. And these conferences took place in different parts in Greece. The one on Aristotle, for example, was actually at his hometown in Stygida near Thessaloniki, way up north in the mainland. But this one was on this beautiful island of Samos. And I have fond memories of that visit to the birthplace of philosophy. It was, like I said, my first visit to Greece, the first conference that I participated in Greece on Ionian philosophy. And it took place on a place called Pythagoria, where the alleged birthplace of Pythagoras. The title of the paper that I gave was The Great Disciple of Heraclitus. And my thesis, which is implicit in the title, was that Heraclitus was Nietzsche's most influential predecessor. But my intentions in that essay were not merely biographical. I wanted to place in relief Heraclitus's principal ideas and to show the practical relevance, the existential relevance of his thought using Nietzsche. So I'm going to read that to you because I think it contains some of the key insights of Heraclitus's thought. So it's called The Great Disciple of Heraclitus. Nietzsche's war, I carefully chose that word because polemos is the source of everything for Heraclitus. And Nietzsche talks a lot about struggle and tension and chaos in his philosophy. And polemos means war in Greek. But when Heraclitus uses the word war, he doesn't mean like two armies fighting it out. He means it in a metaphysical way, that there's a tension, a struggle among the opposite forces in nature. And that's giving birth to everything coming forth. So I was playing with the word war there. But Nietzsche's war against the tradition of Western philosophy is well known. What is not so well known is his unequivocal praise of Heraclitus. In Twilight of the Idols, he wrote, quote, "With the highest respect, I accept the name of Heraclitus." And later, he underlined that in the proximity of Heraclitus, he felt, quote, "warmer and better than anywhere else." But why did Nietzsche set out to critique the entire history of Western philosophy, while at the same time he considered Heraclitus with the highest respect? The answer to this question begins to unfold when we come to realize why Nietzsche declared war on traditional philosophy. In Twilight of the Idols, he puts his finger on those idiosyncrasies of philosophy that he opposes most. Its belief in truth as unchanging being, its hatred of the very idea of becoming, and its aversion and devaluation of change, of strife, and of death. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche calls these idiosyncrasies the will's ill will against time, the spirit of revenge against coming to be and passing away. This is a monumental insight, I think, and we need to return to it again and again as we trace the history of Western philosophy in its early stages. Well, I contend that all the fundamental themes of Nietzsche's thought, as well as his way of thinking and his mode of articulating these themes, they all have their inception in Nietzsche's encounter with Heraclitus, and that Heraclitus is therefore Nietzsche's most influential predecessor, hence the title of my essay. Here, I support this contention by showing that Nietzsche's deliverance from the spirit of revenge has its source in its encounter with Heraclitus. Deliverance from the spirit of revenge would be the next stage in the evolution of the human species, from human to Ubermensch, from Mensch to Ubermensch. But that's not part of my paper. I just thought I'd tell you that. That's an important idea. So when Nietzsche considered who among all the great figures of the past were the ones who traveled his way before, when he considered who were his most influential predecessors, the first name that came to him was Heraclitus. In his notebooks, I found this: my predecessors, Heraclitus, Empedocles, Spinoza, Goethe. In what sense, then, is Heraclitus Nietzsche's most influential predecessor? When we listen to fragment 49, we hear Heraclitus say, "In the same river we both step and do not step. We are and we are not." That's the famous fragment. You can't step into the same river twice, people say. That's the famous fragment by Heraclitus. For Nietzsche, this metaphor pointed to and revealed a negation of the very concept of truth as permanent being. From a positive standpoint, it named impermanence as the only reality. In opposition, something just flashed. In opposition as the basic characteristic and origin of all coming to be. Remember, polemos. According to Nietzsche, the concept of being, with a little b, lowercase b, is nothing other than a form of revenge against the passing of time. It is one way the spirit of revenge manifests itself. The idea of truth as being is the very form of revenge against becoming. It arises because human beings are unable to affirm coming to be and passing away, and the strife at the origin of all coming to be. It means it arises out of a default of man, out of his ill will against the passing of time. Accordingly, deliverance from the spirit of revenge can be accomplished only by virtue of complete and absolute affirmation of coming to be and passing away. This is like the demarcation point between Nietzsche's idea of the human and the overhuman. I didn't say that then, but I know that now. Nietzsche's Nietzsche accepted Heraclitus' position with regard to being as an empty fiction and his conception of impermanence as the basic factum of reality. This insight became one of the cornerstones of Nietzsche's thought. It was because of his encounter with Heraclitus that Nietzsche realized that there is one boundless world flowing upward and downward in eternal rhythmic cycles, showing no tarrying, no indestructibility, no stopping. And so in Twilight of the Idols, he writes, Heraclitus will remain eternally right with his assertion that being is an empty fiction, being with a lowercase b. Being with an uppercase b, that's the logos, that's something else. But Nietzsche also realized that the search for being, the desire to seize the thing in itself, to use a Kantian expression, is the hallmark of traditional philosophy. He realized that philosophy is essentially the will to truth, where truth is conceived as unchanging being. With his negation of the concept of being, Nietzsche therefore declared war on the very foundations of traditional philosophy. Where then does the concept of being originate for Heraclitus and Nietzsche, if it has no basis in the common world of coming to be and passing away? As I've indicated, for Nietzsche, the concept of being appears for man because of his inability to affirm coming to be and passing away. For Heraclitus, the illusion of being also arises because of a default on the part of man. It appears to those who live in their own private worlds. That is to say, beings appear because human beings force the common river of impermanence into their own isolated subjectivity, making static beings out of the river of coming to be and passing away. I think here of Immanuel Kant in his great first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, where substance is one of the categories of the human mind. And so we see the world, the transcendental imagination synthesizes the sense data that's given to the human mind in the form of substance. But that doesn't mean that there's impermanent substance. It only means that's how humans see the world, because that's how our minds are constructed. So there are other people after Nietzsche, or before Nietzsche and after Heraclitus, who would substantiate this in their own terms. But for Kant, it has nothing to do with resentment against becoming or anything. It just has to do with that's how our minds are constructed. These a priori categories, one of which is substance. But for Nietzsche and Heraclitus, it's because human beings see reality disconnected from the boundless whole and not as finite measures of becoming pouring outward from a common logos. It's because of that that beings appear for humans. Nietzsche too asserts that beings appear as such because human beings are unable to affirm becoming and thus force becoming into the categories of their own ego, which is itself an empty fiction. We know that for Heraclitus and Nietzsche, reality is not the totality of beings in the world, but coming to be and passing away. But what is the origin of this coming to be? For Heraclitus, the origin of coming to be is the struggle of opposition, strife, war. The Greek word is polemos. And so he says, war is both king and father of all, and has revealed some as gods, others as men, some it has made slaves, others free. But again, he's not talking about war in the political sense. He's talking about polemos in the metaphysical sense. In his early work, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, the one I'm having you read, Nietzsche offered his first interpretation of Heraclitus. In speaking of Heraclitus' conception of polemos, he said that for Heraclitus, the awakened ones who have stepped out of their own subjective private worlds perceive light and dark, bitter and sweet, up and down, interlocked like wrestlers. This is why, for example, Heraclitus says the way up and down is one and the same. The definite qualities which look permanent to the hoi polloi, to the multitudes, are in fact this helped me a lot in understanding Heraclitus. So when we see things as beings, what is it really? It's the momentary ascendancy of one partner in the contest which endures throughout all eternity. So things are hot because hot has dominated cold for a while, like a wrestler on top of the other one for a moment. But then cold is going to dominate hot and another one. And now the wrestlers turn upside down. So it's just a struggle. And whatever force at that moment assumes ascendancy, that becomes the predominant characteristic of that moment of becoming, like the seasons. So everything comes to be insofar as it's an actuality. And this actuality is the result of the strife of opposing opposites, like that of the bow and the lyre. Heraclitus uses that metaphor. The bow and arrow, the power of the bow and the arrow can fly swiftly because the two sides are pulling in opposite directions. Or in a more euphonic example would be the lyre, the stringed instrument, the precursor to the guitar. The beautiful music is coming from the string being pulled in two opposite directions. So that's an important metaphor that Heraclitus uses. So Nietzsche gives it his romantic flair. He says, all things then come to be as the flash and spark of drawn swords, to use Nietzsche's metaphor, as the momentary radiance of victory in the strife of opposites. That's a very carefully chosen word on Nietzsche's part when he used the word radiance, because in German, let's see, the word shine, erscheinen, means appearance, but it also means to shine. So appearances are a shining. Erscheinen means to appear. It was here that Nietzsche first perceived the basis of his own doctrine of the will to power. All things, he says, come to be as an excess of force, and this force is the result of the struggle of opposites. All events, all motions, all becoming as the determination of degrees and relations of force, as struggle, he writes in his notebooks. And it was here in his encounter with Heraclitus' conception of polemos as the origin of all coming to be that Nietzsche first conceived the basis of his own central task to deliver human beings from the spirit of revenge. The spirit of revenge is rooted in man's ill will against coming to be and passing away. And if all coming to be arises out of strife, then it's precisely on the basis of Heraclitus's affirmation of strife as the origin of all coming to be, as the sovereign justice of Logos, that deliverance from the spirit of revenge is to be established. I remember there's one fragment by Heraclitus. He says that Homer should be whipped for lamenting that strife should be banished from the world. Because if strife were banished, then the world would be banished. So all this arose out of his encounter with Heraclitus' affirmation of the justice of polemos. According to Nietzsche, Heraclitus alone realized that it's precisely in chaos, in the random, in strife, that eternal justice and the greatest beauty are revealed. There's that strange fragment, 124. Heraclitus evokes an image of the most ephemeral, the most chaotic, and randomly structured thing, a dust heap, to depict the fairest universe. He said the fairest universe is a dust heap. The idea that strife is justice, that beauty is found in the ephemeral, in the random, in strife, is for Nietzsche the key idea welling up from the purest things of Hellenism. It was here that the decisive seed was planted in Nietzsche, the germ which would take root and develop into his own central doctrine. When we listen to fragment 52, we hear Heraclitus say that time The Greek word is ion. On is being with a capital B in Greek, and I means everlasting. So the everlasting being with a capital B, not little b. It's important. There are no little b's for Heraclitus and Nietzsche, but only becoming. But there's being. And becoming is pouring forth from being, but it's not disconnected from being. That's why being is always unique, because it's one with the becoming, if that makes sense. That's one of those ideas that take time to think about how being and becoming are united. But there's this wonderful fragment in Heraclitus that the ion, the time, is a child playing a game of draughts, which is, draughts is like a checkered game, a war game, not war really, but competitive game between two people, like checkers or chess, but it's more like checkers. And the Greeks would play this little game. And the fragment goes, the ion is a child playing a game of draughts. The kingship is in the hands of a child. So what does he mean by that? Well, Nietzsche loved this fragment. In this fragment, we can understand further how Nietzsche's deliverance from the spirit of revenge grew out of his encounter with Heraclitus. For it was here in his encounter with this cosmic metaphor that Nietzsche first conceived of the idea of the world as divine play, as beyond good and evil. And it was here also that he first discovered his figure of Dionysus. In fragment 52, Heraclitus presents an image of the logos, of the pure aizun, the ever-living fire, of the ion, the eternal coming to be and passing away of time, as a child playing a war game, a game of draughts. This ion is not an indeterminate being outside the world of substantive multiplicities. It is the hidden harmony of the polymos of opposing forces. The many perishable appearances of our world are neither eternal substances nor fantasies of the senses, as Anaxagoras and Parmenides thought. Strife is the war game that ion plays. The world is the very play of the pure aizun with itself. For Nietzsche, the image of time as a child playing a game of draughts illustrates that coming to be and passing away is not the spectacle of some omniscient judge, but the innocent play of a child. With this imaginative universal, Heraclitus reveals becoming as being ruled not by a moral world order, but by innocence. He took all morality out of reality and thereby bestowed innocence to becoming. With his metaphor of time as a child at play, Heraclitus attained a tragic affirmation of strife. It is tragic because it's an affirmation of the fundamental characteristic of time, namely passing. But it's the highest, deepest, and most comprehensive affirmation because it says yes to all coming to be and to the origin of all coming to be. With this affirmation, the polemos of becoming is transformed into the innocent game of time. Strife is seen as play. And it was also in his encounter with this fragment that Nietzsche conceived of his figure of Dionysus as the union of the two primordial world-building forces of construction, destruction, construction-destruction. When I mention Dionysus, I don't mean the god Dionysus from ancient Greece. I mean Nietzsche's reinterpretation of Dionysus as a philosophical concept, as a characteristic of being with a capital B. It's a pouring forth of creation destruction. Think about it right now. The world is coming to be. Babies are born, people are talking, birds are chirping, chipmunks are chipmunking. But at the same time, it's all passing. People are dying. The chipmunk just went away. The squirrel ran across the road. Time passes. So there's this coming to be and passing away, creation, destruction, creation dash destruction. It's one. giving birth to a world as a work of art. The world is pouring forth as an artwork, but there's no artist. Nietzsche writes in a note in his notebooks, the Dionysian as the playful construction and destruction of the individual world, as the overflow of primordial delight, like the joy we have when we play a game. Thus, the dark Heraclitus compares the world-building force to a playing child. Nietzsche returns to this. He was fond of that fragment. Nietzsche returned to this metaphor again and again because it epitomizes his central task, to purify humanity of its inherent revenge against becoming, and thus to consecrate temporal reality with a sacred yes. In his encounter with Heraclitus, Nietzsche realized that becoming is not punishment for what has come to be, but the innocent play of that which is coming into being. There's no sphere of guilt, of penance, of judgment in this world. The world is not the execution arena of all that is condemned, but the playful drama of time. Okay, so that was my paper. I forget the year it was. I read it to you because, not to teach you Nietzsche's philosophy, that's modern philosophy, but to show you how modern philosophers, well, someone like Nietzsche, can help us to understand more deeply ancient philosophy. But in that essay, I think were some of the key ideas of Heraclitus. And you can see how a great thinker like Nietzsche, a genius like Nietzsche, would take up those ideas and transform them and creatively assimilate ideas and then open up new ways of seeing the world. I remember years ago, and then I'll end this lecture with this. I remember I was visiting my mother who had a home in Florida, so near West Palm Beach in Jupiter, Florida. So I got up early one morning, got my little chair, and I was reading Nietzsche, and it was early. The sun was just rising on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. And there was no one there. And I was just watching the birds. There's the waves. There's this wonderful beach. And then these people came, and they put their blanket down right next to me. And it was a little bit disturbing because they had all kinds of chaos. And they were quarreling about who forgot the Coca-Cola. And then they start playing the radio. And so I was thinking, oh, well, there goes my peaceful bliss, And the little girl, I think she was irritated too by the family a little bit. So she went to the shore right by the water and she started playing. So some time went by. I quit reading my Nietzsche. I was reading Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, and I was thinking about Nietzsche's interpretation of that fragment of the time as a child playing a game of draughts. So here's this little girl, cute as a button, playing by the shore, and she found a seahorse, a dead seahorse, and she set it up and she made like a little castle around it, and she was creating this whole world with the seahorse. And as I walked by, I had this thought that this little girl playing with the seahorse is a child playing. And that was the same kind of energy of the unfolding of the world, that the eternal being, the ion, is a child playing a game. There was this sense of the innocence of becoming. So she became like a metaphor for the whole of unfolding of being. There's a similar idea in Hindu philosophy that I encountered when I was reading the Vedas. It's called Lila, Lila. It means that the unfolding of the world has no purpose, but it's a divine play. So there's no telos, there's no final purpose to the universe. It's not a linear view of time, but it's just unfolding. It's like when you're enjoying yourself and going maybe on a carousel, going around in circles. You're not going anywhere. But the joy of the circle is itself the goal. That there's no purpose, there's no goal unless the joy of the unfolding is the goal. So that's this sense of innocence. So it's a different, instead of a linear conception of time, it's a circular conception of time, like people dancing in a circle. And the joy is in the dance. It's not trying to get somewhere. It's like a game. When you play a game and you're a good player, then you enjoy the game. If you become too competitive and you start thinking linearly in terms of um, winning, then you become a poor loser, right? And you're not enjoying the game. So hopefully that helps to get closer to Heraclitus and Nietzsche's view of the unfolding of time. Okay, so that's part 3. I'm going to try to abbreviate things because we're going to be here forever just talking about the pre-Socratics unless I start abbreviating things. But hopefully you're learning. If you listen to these lectures and do the readings, this should seep in. And I'll let you know what I expect from you and papers next time. Okay. All right. Thank you.